And now for a bit of an advanced topic, but I would like to tie together the last module and this module. In the last module, we talked about Owen and Katana, and you might have noticed when I configured the application to use a Google login, that really what I was doing was configuring Owen middleware, and doing that using the iAppBuilder interface. So this version of ASP.NET is relying on Owen to provide authentication services, both internally when a user creates a local account and logs in, that's what cookie authentication helps with, but also with external providers like Facebook and Twitter and Google. So a couple questions come to mind. One question is, how do Owen and ASP.NET MVC work together to implement authentication? And the second question, a little more detailed, when I logged in with Google, Google told me that this application might be able to see my email address. The question is, if I do want to see the user's email address from this application, how do I do it? Because it's not obvious and it's not there right now. So let me answer these questions by first telling you that for the most part, Owen middleware just sits in a pipeline and can operate pretty much independently. It has no knowledge of what framework is behind it. It doesn't know anything about MVC, although some middleware components will take a bit of a dependency on IAS, and that's true of the Microsoft Security middleware. These middleware components sit in the pipeline, you configure them, you can give them different options, and they can operate pretty much autonomously. For instance, this cookie authentication. Most of these middleware objects will take an options parameter to the method. And for cookie authentication, I can specify different things about the cookie, how I want it to behave. For instance, what is the domain associated with a cookie? Should it be HTTP only, which is true by default because we don't want JavaScript to inspect the cookie? What's the name? What's the path? Should it only be transmitted over HTTPS? Those are the types of things that you can configure in the cookie authentication options. But there are times when ASP.NET MVC needs to know what happened in the Owen middleware. For instance, in the account controller, when a user returns from a site like Google having successfully logged in, one of the things ASP.NET MVC will need to do is find out their login information. All of the redirects and the tokens and the claims, those are all managed by Owen, but when we get into this account controller, we need some details. It's nice that Owen can just establish a user's identity for us, but how do we get details and how do we force a sign out and a sign in? Well, that is all taken care of in the account controller through an authentication manager. And if I press F12 on authentication manager, that will take me to the property definition for authentication manager. I can see it's an iAuthentication manager that's from the Microsoft.owen.security namespace. So this is a component associated with Owen middleware. And in order to get an instance of an authentication manager, what the code will do is go to the current HTTP context, invoke an extension method called getOwenContext, and then look for an authentication property. So getOwenContext is a way that you can get to the Owen context from ASP.NET MVC. That will return the Owen context, including the environment dictionary that we looked at. That's the dictionary of string and object that has everything inside of it. The headers, the response body, the request body, the status codes, all that information is in there. And that context is slightly customized here for ASP.NET in the sense that this Owen context is actually an iOwen context in the Microsoft.Owen namespace. And one of the properties that they added to this context is an authentication property, which is the authentication manager. So since all the authentication has moved into Owen middleware, there is now a way to get the Owen context and find out someone who can manage authentication a little bit, give me a conduit into what's happening in the middleware. And some of the things I can do with the authentication manager include forcing a user to be signed out when they hold an external cookie, letting a user sign in with a local login with a cookie that will be applied so they have a ticket that identifies them as a local user on this website. And one of the other things I can do with the authentication manager, if we go back to the external login callback, is get external login info. So this particular controller action is the action that gets hit after I say that I want to sign in with Google and I successfully authenticate, and now I'm coming back into the application. The application can walk up to the authentication manager, say, please get me some information about this user. And what it returns is a login info. I have a breakpoint right here. I want to show you real quickly what is in login info. So I will launch the application, click login, sign in with Google, which should be automatic now that I've done it before. And here we are at the external login callback. Step down a few lines of code and I can look at login info. All this really contains is my default username and then a login property which just says, yes, this person came from Google and here's a key to help prove it. But there's nothing there about an email address. So how can I get to email address? Well, get external login info async is really an extension method for iAuthentication Manager that simplifies some things. And it takes all the information that might be available from Google and it simplifies it down into an object login info that just contains basically the name and who provided this login info. But I can get to more detailed information, but just be aware of a couple things. One thing is the detailed information that can be present for that external login info will be different from provider to provider. So what you get back from Google might be different than what you get back from Facebook and Twitter. They all share different information by default about a user. But let's at least dig into this to see if I can see it. If instead of asking the Authentication Manager to get external login info, I instead await the Authentication Manager, the authenticate async method, and tell it to use default authentication types.external cookie, because that is the authentication type being used here on an external login callback. Now let's set a breakpoint here and look at this result that I get back from that particular method. So launch the application. Let me go to login. Log in with Google. And now I've hit the external login callback. Let me look inside of the result and we'll see a little bit more richer information. First of all, there is an identity that says, yes, my name is still Scott Allen. There's also some claims associated with this identity, and one of those claims includes my email address. Let's say you really do want to capture email addresses for different types of login, Facebook, Twitter, Google. One thing you'll need to do is make sure that you can get that information from the different third-party providers. For some third-party providers, when you register your application, you have to explicitly mark off a checkbox somewhere that says, I'm going to request the user's email address. And then when that comes back, you'll have to dig in here with the type of the claim, which is this URI, which isn't a real URI that you want to go to. It's just to uniquely identify this particular claim, which is an email address. You'll want to dig around and pull that out and add that to an object that you'll use in the rest of this method and probably pass it in as part of the view model for the view that displays to tell the user, this is the information that we're going to save about you. This is the username. You have a chance to modify it. This is your email address that we now have. And then when they accept that, you could save it all in the database. And that's a good example of how ASP.NET and OWYN middleware can work together through something like the Authentication Manager and the OWYN context that you can get from the current HTTP context.